Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us for this event. This is New Translations of Yiddish Holocaust Literature. My name is Madeleine Cohen, Mindel Cohen, and I'm the Academic Director of the Yiddish Book Center. And we're really pleased and grateful to be able to co-sponsor this event today with the UMass Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. So first off, my thanks to the staff of both organizations who've helped us to organize this. So in the event today, we're going to be hearing from two translators of newly published works of Yiddish literature in translation, both works which represent the Holocaust experiences of the authors, though that's certainly not the only or sole focus of either work. So the two works and our translators are Zackary Sholem Berger, who will speak about and read from his translation of Avrom Sutzkever's Essential Prose, which was published this past December by White Goat Press, which is the publishing imprint of the Yiddish Book Center. And we'll also be hearing from Yermiyahu Ahron Taub, who will speak about and read from May God Avenge Their Blood, a Holocaust memoir triptych by Rachmiel Brix, which was published by Lexington Books in 2020. The books are quite different, and I'm hoping that one of the things that we'll discuss in the translators' presentations and in our discussion afterwards is how we read these works and how we can read them, what happens when we bring them together to read them in this genre of Holocaust literature as memoir, or especially in the case of Sutzkever's work as prose or as fiction or as poetry that's also informed by personal lived experience. One thing these books and the translations have in common is that they are both part of ongoing projects to make more works of Yiddish literature available to English reading audiences. And that includes many important resources about the Holocaust and post-Holocaust experiences. Many great works of Yiddish literature remain to be translated into English and other languages. And Yiddish sources have often been underutilized in the history of the study of the Holocaust, though this is certainly something that's been changing in recent years. And I imagine it's quite likely there are some people in the audience tonight, along with our translators, whose work as researchers and translators has participated in changing this trend and in bringing Yiddish language resources into the world of Holocaust studies. The Yiddish Book Center is working to support new translations from Yiddish in a number of different ways. And one of those is a fellowship program for literary translators, which both of our translators today, Zackary and Yermiyahu, have participated in. The program is now entering its 9th year, and each year it supports a group of about 10 translators who are working to translate a book-length project from Yiddish to English. The fellowship provides them with a small stipend, a translation mentor, and several workshops in which they can share and discuss their work with a group of peers, as well as with professional literary translators. It's very exciting for us that more and more of these fellowship projects are being published in recent years, including both of these two works that we will learn more about tonight. So we're really excited that in addition to that fellowship program that supports translators to participate in programs like this that help readers and audiences discover these works that are newly available in English, works that have previously only been accessible by and large to Yiddish language readers. So I'm going to introduce each speaker before they speak and present and share from their translation with us. And I'll just remind you that after both presentations, we'll have time for questions from you and the audience for our two translators. So I encourage you to use the Q&A button at any point during the event to send your questions, and I'll help assemble them and share them with our translators at the end for a discussion. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. First, we're going to hear from Zackary Sholem Berger. Zackary is a multilingual poet and translator, true of both of our presenters today. He's published multiple books of his own poetry in Yiddish, English, and Hebrew. He's also translated in a variety of genres for children and adults, for secular and Hasidic readers. His translations of Yiddish poetry have appeared in Poetry Magazine, The Forward, and other publications. A doctor by profession, Zachary lives in Baltimore with his Yiddish-speaking family. Thanks very much, Zachary. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you to the organizers of this event and to you, Mindel. And obviously, it's really a pleasure to be in the same event with Yermiyahu Ahron Taub. This is not the first event we've done together, but he's really meant so much to me. His role modelship and companionship and literary example, so it's really great to be with him today. I'm going to start by saying a few words about Avrom Sutzkever, poet, what it means to classify his work in the genre of Holocaust literature, which I think I take in some large measure I agree with for maybe obvious reasons, and for some smaller reasons I take some polite issue with. And then I'm going to read in its entirety a short work of prose poetry from the book, from this book that I'm so grateful that White Goat Press has issued. And the short prose poem I'm going to read is from 1978 called "The Beggar with the Blue Glasses." I should say at the outset that I know that after having taken a brief look at the participants, that among those viewing the Zoom today are some true scholars of Eastern European history and Yiddish and Avrom Sutzkever and the Holocaust. I'm not a scholar of the Holocaust, but I am a long-term Liebhaber, lover of Avrom Sutzkever's work. And in brief, for those who don't know Avrom Sutzkever, he is, without exaggeration, one of the most important lyric poets of the 20th century in any language, and certainly among the very most esteemed and important Yiddish poets of the century. He is renowned as a lyric poet, as a writer of lyric works that are both, so lyric works properly said, that is shorter meditations on the self, both formalist and less formalist, more modernist, and of longer epic and narrative works. And the sweep of his poetic works is remarkable for any poet. And the topics and the imaginary and historical and narrative setting of these longer epic narrative works marks the narrative and the history of the Jewish people in the 20th century. So it's not an accident that Avrom Sutzkever is often mentioned as a Yiddish poet whose peregrinations and transformations and tragedies and survivorships match the Yisurim Weg, match the Via Dolorosa of the Jewish people during the century. As is well known, he was born in Smorgon in Lithuania, moved to Siberia with his parents as a small child, returned to Lithuania, and was a leading figure in a group of writers and cultural figures in Vilna, and was a major figure in maybe a second, or one might even say a third wave of the modernization or the modernification of Yiddish literary languages and institutions. But he was something of an exception in that group. And I'm going to speak a little bit about why and use that as a segue to talking about Avrom Sutzkever's work as Holocaust literature or not Holocaust literature. And what I'm saying is sort of speculative, because I think there's a lot to be said about how Avrom Sutzkever differed from his contemporaries. And many scholars, including Ruth Weiss and Justin Kami, have talked about Sutzkever's different orientation compared to his colleagues. One claim that's been somewhat made is, or not infrequently made, is that Sutzkever was less political. I don't think that's true. But he was perhaps more bold and ideological in the details of his self-presentation. Sutzkever saw himself, I think, from his very earliest works as a kind of prophet poet, as a neo-romantic prophetic figure who bestrode history. And while we can say, obviously, that the Holocaust represented a dramatic and tragic rupture in Jewish and world history, I think it's not saying too much to say that Sutzkever's self-perception had a measure of continuity before, through, and after the Holocaust. Again, greater experts than I have talked about this, but the question is Sutzkever's literature during and after the Holocaust to be classified in Holocaust literature as a genre? And I think there's a couple of ways in which we might bracket and question that organization. And I'm going to mention two ways before I segue to the reading that I'm going to do. One way we might question or bracket or complicate, to use a popular term, that categorization is understanding the Holocaust as a international and people-centered event, something that happened on the world stage and with groups of people, compared to the Holocaust as an individual event, something that happened for each individual differently. And then there's another way of complicating the designation of Holocaust literature, and that is the Holocaust as a singular event in history. It started in a certain year, ended in another year, in a certain part of the world, and then stopped. It had a beginning, and then it had terminus ad quem, it had an end, and then it ceased to happen. But we all know that historical events don't actually happen that way in the lives of individuals. They happen and they continue happening and they reoccur happening. There's a wonderful image about Sutzkever's work from the Jewish scholar David Volpe, who compared Sutzkever's work to a spiral because he returns continually to repeating motifs. And I think his repetition of motifs is a way of understanding the limitations of the genre Holocaust literature, because he kept writing these motifs from the beginning of the destruction of East European Jewry, till the end of his life. So one must ask, these prose poems, which I'm about to read, and I'm going to give a brief introduction to the book before I read this short piece. These works were written in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the short piece I'm going to read is from 1978. Is this a work of Holocaust literature? Is it a work of Zionist literature because Sutzkever lived in Israel and was very clearly a Zionist? Is it a work of diasporic literature because he also saw himself as a resident of the Jewish diaspora? So I'm going to say very briefly a couple words about this book, Sutzkever Essential Prose. It includes prose poetry pieces, which at various stages Sutzkever called either Prosa Beschreibungen, descriptions, or Erzählungen, and really prose poetry miniatures ranging in length from a few pages to 10 or 20 pages, published in the Golden Kate, the literary journal that Sutzkever founded and edited from 1947 until his death, and edited from his seat from his residence in Tel Aviv. These pieces, as I was trying to say in complicating the notion of Holocaust literature as applied to Sutzkever, range. They hit for the cycle. They include descriptions of character types, love affairs, memoirs of escape from murderous bands, but they are perhaps in a lack of in their lack of historical specificity, not about the Holocaust per se. They are about the Jewish tragedies that encountered Sutzkever and that he underwent as an individual and that his characters underwent. And I think one thing I explore in my introduction to the work is how, in a certain sense, ahistorical and out of time Sutzkever's prose poetry miniatures are. The other thing I should say about the work is it is marked by an introduction by Heather Valencia, who is a Sutzkever scholar. And the other thing I should say is that it has been gone over and immeasurably improved by my collaborators at the press, including the editors and the copy readers. So it's been really a beneficial undertaking. So with that introduction about Sutzkever and this work of prose poetry, which I think is unique in his work. Obviously, he's a lyric poet. He's an epic and narrative poet. He is something of a dramatist in a less significant way. He writes nonfiction. He edited a journal, but prose poetry occupies a perhaps underexamined corner in his work. The story I'm going to read is called "The Beggar with the Blue Glasses." It is from 1978. The Beggar with the Blue Glasses. You see a beggar, a walking bundle of rags. Either the beggar's hand is like a seashell, thrust out by the sea onto dry land, without an ear to hear its cry, or it's a crippled beggar betrayed by his legs, which left him for someone else. And you walk past him with thoughts like magnets, polarized in the opposite direction. It doesn't occur to you to get acquainted. You aren't curious enough to ask his name and whether he was born to a mother, whether his mother was a girl once. But something happens. While you're walking by the beggar, an idea chases you like a pony, like a lightning bolt dashing after a cloud. You want to pluck loose your past sins, so you come to a stop and let a drop of metal fall in front of the beggar. Your conscience is relieved. That's it. Away you go. No word, no smile. Why should I lie? I've rarely smiled at a beggar myself, even rarely smiled back like I do with a skeleton. So it went on like that, as long and as short as it did, till the angel who guarded my pen decided I should write this story. And shaped before me, there was a beggar with blue glasses. The guy in blue glasses appeared on the corner of my narrow street, next to the mailbox colored sunset red that I have fed for years now with letters to my friends and unfriends, like it's a living creature. It's possible he was standing here before and begging then too, but suddenly I really saw him. It's quite a distance from seeing to perceiving. This is how it happened. I hurried out onto the street at dawn, carrying with me a letter, still warm, for the red mailbox. The city was still empty without the steam of people. Two birds sang each other awake. As I held the envelope at the rusted mouth of the mailbox, I heard a voice in Yiddish, "A donation for an inanimate object and not for a beggar." That's when I saw him for the first time, like a tree appearing out of the fog. Besides his blue glasses, my memory took note of his small beard, like a radish just pulled out of the ground. What does the blueness of his glasses recall? Blue fragments of glass found in childhood that make you happy like no treasure can. Let the mailbox stay hungry today, I decided. I was happy that the beggar's argument provided a reason. I had written the letter too excitedly, with a boyish, unchecked jealousy. And if the iron golem had indeed devoured the letter, God forbid, I would have looked for a match to light it on fire inside. I tore the letter and the envelope into shreds, and my jealousy was shredded up in me too. But instead of my thanking the guy with the blue glasses, a needle jumped out of my tongue and stabbed him with a sharp word. "You're at work so early." A bony smile shone. Only the dead have it easy. If the living knew who I was, they'd come to me all the way from Honolulu. So let's imagine I come from Honolulu. But let's get acquainted first. I stuck out my hand. What I go by is, you don't offer your hand to a hangman or a beggar, and if you do, there should be a coin in it. The bony smile shone again. Just my luck. My pockets were empty. The guy in the blue glasses took pity on me. An honest person will visit me at home to return a debt. Here's my card. The city was taking on motion. Bricks poured down from the walls and became people hurrying along. Cars were shuffled like playing cards. The sunrise ascended to the seventh heaven. The day after, and the one after that I did not perceive the beggar with the blue glasses next to the mailbox. I was beginning to think it had been a dream, a nightmare. But then I felt his calling card in my pocket. Horaci Adelkind, philosopher and wise man, with the street and the house number. That same evening, I went to pay him a visit. No, it wasn't a made-up address. My suspicions were for naught. He himself, the philosopher and wise man, invited me into his room with a knightly bow. He looked a little different here, wearing a cape and boots, a yarmulke woven with silver threads on the tip of his skull. His blue glasses were on a side table on top of a stack of paper, illuminated by a hanging lantern. I'm no longer a beggar, so we can shake hands, he said, smacking his lips. So let's be casual. I don't like to speak formally. Yiddish is a beautiful language, but all praise to the holy tongue, in which one always speaks in the second person, with beggars as with princes. He brought me a rocking chair. Cognac or a glass of wisdom? Make it a glass of wisdom, a strong one. The rocking chair teetered underneath me. Before the glass burns my ear, I have a question. Why the comedy? Dressing up as a beggar? One glass of wisdom isn't enough for you. He crouched in the rocking chair opposite me. Every human being is born with a mask. Their skin is that mask. Even so, they put on more masks to disguise the first ones. If I hadn't disguised myself as a beggar, I would have really been a beggar. Where's the logic in that? Logic plus logic is demagogic. You with a question like that. Everything is habit. You're an eagle if you just get used to it. If a person were born with 7 legs, you and I would seem to him like desperate cripples. Man is not a cosmic animal, as my colleague Schopenhauer teaches, but a cosmic person, as Horaci Adelkind teaches. And the cosmic human being, which I am the classic example of, must change their skin mask, and not just on his face. He has to change so death won't find him. If such things are comedy for you, that's a personal tragedy. Let's shuffle the cards again. If I hadn't begged, your pupils would have deleted me from existence, and you would have actually put your letter in the mailbox. Do you know what would have happened then? I would have eaten myself alive. You both would have died of hunger from such a dish, you and her. Both rocking chairs and us inside, like the two ends of a ship, we rocked over sighing waves. The former beggar with the blue glasses and the current philosopher and wise man, Horaci Adelkind, splashed with the rudder. Since you know the secret of my disguise, I'll tell you the secret of my self-revelation. You owe me a debt that's more than the sum of all the coins I have gathered. Here's your debt, to be my heir. I, the cosmic person, have no one left on our small planet. My near and nearest have left for the galaxies. My only friend is quite a different creature. I am so lonely that I recently asked a psychiatrist to make me sick with schizophrenia, to split my personality so I wouldn't be so lonely. Did it help? Yeah, I got twice as lonely. That's what you want me to be the heir of? Not that. I want you to be the heir of my wisdom, my aphorisms. I've written 70,000 pages. And what do you want me to do with them, for instance? Publish them in 700 leather-bound gilded volumes. Before I assume this sweet burden, I want to have the merit of hearing some of these aphorisms. Here's one. We understood each other well, the gorilla and me. Unfasten these bars, she said. Then we can chat. Here's another one. A single moment is as old as time. A third. You're far away. You're too far away for us to get closer. Too close for us to get distance. A fourth. One of you will not betray me, Jesus said to his disciples, and that one was himself. A fifth. Tears are sparkling eye words. A sixth. Men are created in plural, women in singular. A seventh. Silly painter, don't complain to the tree that it grows and blossoms realistically. An eighth. I'm a boarder in my own body. I pay rent with my tears. When I don't have anything to pay with, the owner will evict me into the cold and rain. A ninth, too soon, got to be too late. A tenth, I'm not less than anyone, but less than myself. For myself, I'm just a little one who's barely cut his teeth. With the nimbleness of a kitten, Horatzi Adelkind got up, took the hanging lantern off its hook, and shone it on the loaded shelves. Dear heir, my writings are hovering on these walls. Mazel tov! They are now transferred to your authority. My past is my future. Barely a knock on the door. His voice was hoarse. It's my only friend. This is the time he comes by. I already hinted that my only friend is quite a different creature. He's a worm. A hoary gray worm brings his thoughts here, and I wipe them down. The writer, Shlovatsky, he says, was an angel secretary, and I, Horatzi Adelkind, am a worm secretary. Do you want me to introduce you? I blocked his path. Another time. Enough for today. Is there a back door? Horatzi Adelkind lifted his lamp over me and pulled at my sleeve. Yes, there is. And you'll take a gift from me, my blue glasses. You'll be able to disguise myself as a beggar and be a cosmic person. That's Avrom Sutzkever, the beggar with the blue glasses.
Thank you so much, Zachary. I'll remind people that if you have any questions for Zachary about his translation, about Sutzkever, please feel free to send them using the Q&A box, and we'll have discussion with both of our translators after our next presentation. So I'm very pleased now to introduce Yermiyahu Ahron Taub, the translator of May God Avenge Their Blood, a Holocaust memoir triptych by Rachmil Brix. It was published in 2020 by Lexington Books. Yermiyahu is the author of 6 books of poetry, which, like Zachary, include poetry in English and Yiddish. I don't know if we'll get to talk about your poetry in this event, but it's an interesting reason to have you both here together, an interesting connection. In addition to these 6 books of poetry, Yermiyahu is also the author of 2 books of fiction, including Beloved Comrades, a novel in stories, also published in 2020 by Anafra Literary Press. And Beloved Comrades was just named a finalist for the 2020 Forward Indies in the religious adult fiction category. Thank you, Yermiyahu, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mindel. And I'd like to thank UMass Amherst Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies and the Yiddish Book Center for bringing this event. I want to thank Mindel and Leslie and Paz for all your help and all your hard work, and anyone else involved. I am so delighted to be sharing the virtual stage with Sholem, who I've known for so many years, my longtime comrade in Yiddish land. So it's really great to be with you. I also want to thank Bella Brix Klein, the author's daughter, Rachmil Brix's daughter, for her tireless support of my translation project and for her ongoing advocacy of her father's work. And again, circling back to the Yiddish Book Center for giving me a fellowship where this book really came alive, and for supporting it in other ways, which I'll get into later in the talk. So, who was Rachmil Brix, and why was I drawn to translating these memoirs? And here they are: Die wir sein nicht geblieben, and Die Antläufers and Publicista zum Leben in the blue. Why do I find them significant? Rachmil Brix was an extraordinary writer in the humanist tradition. His work is characterized by a flair for lively description and narration, deep empathy for his characters, and a carefully calibrated attention to moral complexity. Even in the darkest of circumstances, he's interested in the humanity of all those he is observing, including perpetrators of evil. Brix was particularly adept at capturing the dialogue of a wide spectrum of protagonists: Jews in the shtetl of every political and religious persuasion, passengers on trains, pedestrians on the street, and concentration camp inmates and their guards, among many others. Similarly, his humanist interest is apparent in the carefully hewn folk style he perfected. Written in spare, almost documentary-like prose, his texts reverberate in emotional urgency and power. This understatement was quite purposeful. As he argued in How to Write Churban Literature, translated by Joseph Lefwich, how can it, writing about the Holocaust, be done? By writing concisely, compressed, without embellishment, without adornment. We must not repeat. We must avoid any superfluous word in prose, even more than in poetry. Later he wrote, I hold that we must express the hardest thought in the simplest way so that everyone will understand. Okay, here we go, the big test. Let's see if our share screen works. Okay, and okay. So, Those Who Didn't Survive, the first work in the triptych, is an elegiac, deeply moving memoir of Brix's shtetl, Skarżysko-Kamiana, Poland. And here you can see Skarżysko-Kamiana. It's between, as Brix describes, between Radom and Kielce, up there. And here's Skarżysk here, and here's Lodz up here on the left. And we'll talk more about Lodz later. As its title demonstrates, the book eschews a self-focused approach, centering instead on the author's maternal great-uncle, Reb Mendel Feldman, a wealthy chassid with influence in the Jewish and Polish spheres. And here's Reb Mendel and his second wife, Basha Feldman. Indeed, the book's entire first passage is devoted to a physical description of Reb Mendel and a highly detailed description of his clothing. The reader gets to feel the weight, solemnity, and color vibrating beneath this extended sartorial meditation. And you really sense the kind of emotional urgency there is. You feel like Brix is writing for his life and also for the lives of those who perished. Significantly, we learn early on that Rachmiel Brix, the author, was named after Reb Mendel's learned father. Taken as a whole, this first book is part character study, part reportage, part collection of folkways and vignettes. The protagonists are colorfully described and the scenarios are expertly drawn. Brix presents the shtetl's folk traditions, an extended cast of characters, while always deftly returning the thread back to Reb Mendel. In the process, a vivid collective portrait of an annihilated Jewish community emerges. What initially appears to be a hagiographic approach on the part of the author to the text's larger-than-life, almost mythic main character slowly moves in quite a different direction altogether. It is certainly tempting to view Reb Mendel's life and end as a metaphor for the fate of Polish Jewry itself. In this work, Brix's narrative approach is unconventional. There are no chapter breaks or readily apparent chronology. The book is more a panorama, chock full of anecdotes, characters, customs, and details than a traditional memoir with a linear narrative drive. We meet individuals from nearly every sector and political stripe of society, Jew and Pole, rich and poor and in between, men and women, religious and secular, Zionist and socialist. We meet Brix's maternal grandmother, Liebe, the sister of Reb Mendel, who, like her brother, gave generously and unhesitatingly to the poor. We meet Yidel Kogan, Rachmiel's maternal uncle, known as Yidele with the Fiedele, who wasn't named, a musician, who wasn't named because he was wasn't given a Jewish name. Yidel is just generic little Jew, because he was uncircumcised. This was permitted by the rabbi because his mother had lost 6 previous sons in childbirth due to circumcision. Reb Mendel's daughter, Esther Rivka, who elopes in marriage to a non-chassid. The ne'er-do-well Shmuel Yoine, with his dreams of striking it rich, and so many others. Here's a description by Brix of Chaim Yankel, Cockle-Doodle-Doo. Who was Chaim Yankel, Cockle-Doodle-Doo? He was the leading lunatic of the shtetl, the son of a tailor, an old bachelor, industrious, always engaged in the hard labor of carrying water, chopping wood, cleaning, and sweeping. He worked at the bakeries. Whenever he was given a few groshens, he clapped his hands like a rooster flapping his wings before crowing. He even crowed like a rooster, cockle-doodle-doo, entertaining bystanders. The schoolboys in particular had fun playing around with him. In World War II on Simchas Torah, as the Germans and Ukrainians liquidated the ghetto of Kamiana, Chaim Yankel cockle-doodle-doo hid in the boiler of the mikveh where he was shot. Chaim Yankel cockle-doodle-doo was a regular guest in Remendel's home too. And here we see the kind of layered density of Brix's language. Just in this one passage, we learn about the character, we learn about his background, we learn about what he did, his relationship to the other villagers, his fate in the Holocaust, which is a constant leitmotif, even in this first book of the triptych. We learn about his end, and then again, we learn about his connection to Remendel. We learn how tea was cooked and kept heated on the Sabbath, how weddings were celebrated, how prayer services were conducted, what kind of pastries were given at ritual circumcision ceremonies. Largely assuming the observational position of anthropologists, Brix makes rich use of his powers of description and talents at capturing authentic dialogue and compelling narration. Only occasionally does he insert himself into the events of the book. This next sequence of slides are from my trip to Poland in 2018 in support of this translation project. And this trip was partially funded by the Yiddish Book Center. And again, I'm just so grateful for all their support. This is my friend Pearl Gluck, the filmmaker, on the left. And we began in Krakow. There's a very crucial scene in Die Antläufers, the middle book of the anthology, where after Brix is released from a series of internment situations, it's a miracle that he was released. He finds himself in Krakow. What does he do in Krakow? He goes to search for Mordechai Gebirtig because he's heard that Mordechai Gebirtig lives in Kazimierz, the Jewish quarter of Krakow. So there's a lot of sort of miraculous things that happened on this trip that I want to share. So I had known Gabi von Zeltmann, the filmmaker, and she introduced me to Uwe, her partner. Uwe was finishing up his biography, his German language biography of Mordechai Gebirtig, the great folk poet. You've all heard his songs. Even if you didn't know they were his. So in this book, in Die Antläufers, there's a crucial chapter in which Brix describes his meeting with Gebirtig. It's a beautiful chapter. It's really haunting. Uwe had not known about this meeting. And so I showed him the chapter in Die Antläufers and he was completely blown away. And he told his publisher to stop the presses on his biography of Gebirtig because he wanted to include something about this encounter between Brix and Gebirtig in his biography. And that's what he did. And it was just so completely surreal that a biographer of Gebirtig meets a translator of Brix. And then the translator shows the chapter of Brix meeting Gebirtig in the book. And so all of us went, they had the key to this, Uwe and Gabi had this key to Gebirtig's courtyard. Don't ask me how. So that's Hannah Rosenfeld on the right, who's also a translator of Yiddish and a all-around longtime Yiddishist, cultural activist. With Pearl, we all went to Gebirtig's house in Krakow, and there's all the signage. We went into the courtyard, and based on Brix's description, Uwe thought he could identify where the exact floor where Gebirtig lived. So after Krakow, we went to Auschwitz and Birkenau. Brix was interned in Auschwitz. I'm not going to show slides of that. And then we went to Skarżyska Kamiana. This is the Kamiana River, which is beautifully described in Die was nicht geblieben, the first book that I'm talking about. Before I went, I got some information from Bella Brix-Klein, Rachmel's daughter, and based on what a cousin wrote her, they believe that this was the last home where the Briggs family lived in Skarzysk. So I did find a war memorial, a general war memorial. Bella found a Jewish memorial, a memorial for the Jews who perished in Skarzysk. And this is a book, this is images of us looking for traces and not being super successful. But what I want to share is that there is a gravitas, there's a dignity, there's a power in searching. There is a power in looking in Yiddish land for traces. We didn't find that much of the Jewish quarter, but we did find a home of a pioneering Polish scientist. And I just love this house. So in Die was nicht geblieben, there's a section about the destruction of the Jewish cemetery. There was a Jewish cemetery that we found, but it may have been, presumably it was somehow reconstructed. And there's Sarah Liba Basi Rachmiel is the gravestone on the right. And I've asked Bella and she doesn't know who that is, but all of those names are part of the Briggs fold, the Briggs family fold. So they could be relatives or maybe they're not. We also went to Lodge afterwards, and the image on the left, is the image of Freedom Square. And Briggs describes that in the opening chapters fairly graphically and powerfully in Die Untitled. The image on the right is the covered gateways. And there are many scenes in Die Untitled where people are just hiding under these gateways to escape the air raid sirens, to escape bombs that they've heard about are coming. They're very graphic, they're very intense, and just seeing these spaces really helped me as a translator. It was one of those moments where things just kind of click and fall into place. Also in Lodge, we went to the Marek Edelman Center, and there was a placard devoted to Rachmiel Briggs. This really touched me. This is the Jewish Community Center in Lodge, and there is a sign for classes on the left for Yiddish, which I found incredibly moving. The Lodge Jewish Cemetery, on the right, there's the mausoleum for Poznański, and one of the characters in Die was nicht geblieben is ironically called Poznański. Poznański was like the Polish Rockefeller, the Jewish Polish Rockefeller. And we went to his palace, and it really was a palace. This character in Die was nicht geblieben was very poor, so that term is used ironically. We stayed in Old Lodge, and this was our building, and I like to think that it wasn't that dissimilar from a building that Briggs lived in. So I'm going to stop share at the moment, and then we'll come back to all that. So in The Fugitives, the second book of the triptych, Briggs really emerges more fully as a character. Here he describes his experiences from the breakout of war in September 1939 until the establishment of the Lodz ghetto in May 1940. He portrays the confusion and uncertainty in the population as the German army advances into Poland. In Lodz, the terror inflicted by the air raid sirens, the race to shelter, the search for food as supplies dwindle are captured to great and dramatic effect. Mass media plays a pivotal role in the narrative as Briggs highlights the interplay between actors shaping the political events of world history and everyday people. Citizens seek to comprehend the increasingly comprehensible development they hear about on Polish radio, but the propaganda only foments chaos and panic. The effects of propaganda are visible throughout The Fugitives and From Agony to Life in both the dialogue spoken and actions taken by numerous individuals Briggs encountered in the war years. And as readers coming to this history and coming to these historical texts, for me, it was especially powerful to think about propaganda and the role of propaganda in shaping the population. And that's a question that really animated Briggs. Some of the most powerful scenes, excuse me, in The Fugitives' work are of the citizens of Lodz on the move, crowding the highways with their valuables piled up, desperate to escape the bombings. The German net ensnares Brix, and he experiences the horrors of captivity at the hands of the Nazis even before his internment in the Lodz ghetto. So there are really three eras or periods of captivity in Brix's life. In these early these early incarceration camp situations, then in the Lodz ghetto, and then in Auschwitz and other work camps. So three separate, distinct periods in his life of captivity and incarceration. Brix depicts the anti-Semitism in the Polish population, but also the moments of kindness shown him and others. Consider this passage from The Fugitives. When we arrived in the village, we saw that all the cottages were full of fugitives who were retreating home. The peasants received them hospitably. They cooked potatoes for them and gave them milk. In the field, I spotted a poorly maintained old cottage with a straw roof. I said, "Let's try over there." When we approached, a young peasant woman with a small child greeted us warmly. There wasn't a single fugitive here. "Is that it? Is the war over?" she naively asked. "Praise Jesus Christ. In that case, my husband will also be coming home. Maybe you've seen him somewhere. He was taken for military service 2 weeks ago." How naive she is, I thought. The war has only just begun. And her husband, perhaps the Germans have captured him, or who knows, he might have fallen on the battlefront. I envisioned her as a young widow with a little orphan. I comforted her. "Sister, your husband will certainly come home, but it will take a while because he has to go by foot and it's a long way from here." On her young, beautiful face, a hopeful smile emerged. But just as quickly, she grew pensive and her sadness returned. The woman quickly peeled and cooked potatoes and warmed up some milk. We ate and were refreshed. Then she cut 2 pieces of homemade black bread for us and said, "The mill is still standing, but who knows when I'll be able to ground rye to bake bread." The bread tasted delicious. I marveled at her generosity. After the meal, I took out money to pay her, but she didn't want to accept it. After I pleaded with her, she finally relented and accepted the money. She said that we could sleep in the attic, on the hay, or in the stable on the straw. We went into the stable, closed the door, and lay down on the straw. Brix and his fellow traveler debated whether to stay a while at this Polish woman's house. Brix allowed himself to be convinced to go back on the road, a decision that would have fateful consequences for them both. In contrast to Holocaust memoirs that gloss over the events at the beginning of the war or begin with the internment in ghettos, The Fugitives dramatically delineates the hopes, uncertainty, and mounting desperation of the early stages of the war before the Nazis tightened their chokehold over Poland and mastered the machinery of industrial-scale genocide. I am not aware of any memoir that portrays this period with such detail and power. The final work in this triptych, From Agony to Life, From Geschichte zum Leben, charts Brix's deportation to, experiences in, and liberation from Auschwitz and other internment camps. His depiction of the camp experience is relentless. The effects of starvation, privation, and brutality on the body and the soul, the tedium in the camps, and the terror in being shunted from one camp to another are rendered with stark clarity. Brix probes the dark recesses of human agency, sparing no one, least of all himself, from his own unflinching eye. He finds moments of connection and courage amidst the conditions of extremity. His belief in art as a life force and his commitment to his own calling as an artist is a leitmotif in this and indeed in all 3 of the works translated here. So that's a little bit about the books I've translated. And now I want to speak briefly about Brix himself. Born and raised in a Hasidic milieu in Skarżysko-Kamiana, Poland in 1912, Brix was a prolific and highly acclaimed Yiddish poet and writer. He was the 3rd of 8 children. His book of poems, Young Green May, Young Green Mai, appeared in 1939. At the outbreak of World War II, he was in the industrial city of Lodz, working as a hat maker and house painter. Most of his immediate and extended family perished in Treblinka on Simchas Torah in 1942. His brother Yitzchak perished in Auschwitz. His brother Simcha Elazar served in the Polish army against the Nazis, and helped liberate Poland. In June 1946, a Polish nationalist shot and killed Simcha and his bride, Sonia Milstein, 2 days before their wedding. Let's see if I can share a screen again. Okay. So as part of my research, I went to the YIVO archives, where there's a magnificent monumental collection of Brix's writings and things that he collected that Bella organized. And this is one of the letters that I found. It's from Simcha, again, who was shot by the Polish nationalists after the war, to Rachmiel. He says, I found our youngest brother, Yasala. He's grown into a fine young man, a full round face overflowing with life. And he also tries to help Rachmiel find copies of his books, Yungri Mai, which was burned. It was just so haunting coming across these letters. Imagine like having survived the war and then to be shot afterwards. I found Simcha's story just really, really haunting. Let's see if I can. This is a letter from Simcha to Rachmiel. I've fallen in love with a young woman. Her name is Sonia Milstein. And those, there's sometimes when you're in the archives and you're just frantically trying to like get photos of all these massive piles of documents, and there's a document that just calls out to you, and your bones grow cold. It's just bone chilling seeing this letter. There's many treasures in the YIVO archives, in the Brix collection, that remain for scholars to explore in greater depth. Of his immediate family, only Rachmiel, his brother Yosef, and his sister Liebe survived the war and its aftermath. Brix was interned in the Lodz ghetto, as we've discussed, from 1940 to 1944, where he continued to write and participate in literary events. And in August 1944, he's transferred to Auschwitz and later to Wattenstadt, Ravensbrück, and Woblin. After the war, he made his way to Stockholm, Sweden, where he met Hinda Irene Wolf, and they were married in 1946. They had 2 daughters, Miriam Serla and Bella Svea. In conjunction with his public literary engagements in Stockholm, Brix was writing about his experiences during the war. For example, writing about his experiences during the war, even at that early point. He dated the writing of his book, Av Kiddush Hashem, Stockholm, 1947 to 1954. And in the YIVO archives, I found a clipping from the Vorwärts, the Yiddish forward, that notes that he was then a resident of Stockholm and that his poetry and prose on the Lodz ghetto had been translated into Polish and Swedish. Even at this early stage, immediately after the war, Brix did everything in his power to render his trauma visible. In addition to his literary work, he was active in Sweden on behalf of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. He collected materials from the Jewish communities in Stockholm, including from the displaced persons milieu in Sweden. The aforementioned article notes that he was a special correspondent in Sweden for YIVO. He was awarded his own stamp as a collector. He played a crucial role in getting the Nachman Zonnabend collection of primary source documents from the Lodz ghetto brought to YIVO. He met with Zonnabend in Stockholm on numerous occasions and convinced him to send the materials to YIVO. In March 1949, the family emigrated from Sweden to the United States. Brix devoted the next 25 years until his death to writing about the Holocaust, sending selections of his work out to periodicals, corresponding with Yiddish writers and editors, submitting articles and opinion pieces to Yiddish newspapers, and participating in the world of Yiddish letters. In addition to Yungri Mai, the aforementioned Av Kiddush Hashem, and 3 memoirs presented in this volume, he also published 3 books on his 4 years in the Lodz ghetto. These are the testimonial novels, Der Kaiser in Ghetto, The Tsar, or the King of the Ghetto, Die Papierene Kroon, The Paper Crown, as well as the long poem Ghetto Fabrik 76, Ghetto Factory 76. Rachmiel Brix's writing was highly regarded in Yiddish circles and beyond. He won praise from Nobel laureates Agnon and Basheva Singer, critics such as Mukdoni, scholars of Yiddish, Irving Howe, and Saul Lipson. Mukdoni wrote, "Everything that Yermiyahu Briggs writes is important both as historical material and as artistic creation. He possesses the sharp eyes of an artist that penetrates within as if with X-ray vision into the souls of people." His work has been translated into numerous languages, including Hebrew and German. It was translated into English by S. Morris Engel, who's pictured on the left here. And A Cat in the Ghetto was, the novella was turned into a stage play called The Windows of Heaven by Shimon Winselberg. And there were productions in Stockholm and London. This is the program from the London production. And here's more of the program. He was, over 400 people attended the 1964 symposium sponsored by the Herzl Institute. Dr. Sidney Rosenthal introduced Briggs as one of the most important writers of our time. Yermiyahu Briggs died in New York City in 1974. Widely known for his poems, novellas, and stories, it is my hope that the publication in English of Briggs's previously untranslated memoirs will further enhance his reputation. I am delighted that new readers can now appreciate these autobiographical works from a gifted Yiddish writer whose life and creativity were cut short by his premature death, an artist who remained steadfast despite immense affliction in his commitment to his art and his folk. And that is it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yermiyahu. Now we have some time for discussion with both Yermiyahu and Zachary. And so I'll remind people you're welcome to submit questions using the Q&A box, and I'll read them for you. But I think I'll use my moderator's privilege to get to start with a question of my own, and probably won't surprise either of you that I'd like to ask a question about the work of translation for both of you in these projects. I get to work on our translation fellowship program, and I've discovered that as magical as translation is for me, editing and workshopping and kind of discussing with translations with people has become something that I really value and learn a great deal from. So I think maybe it's interesting talking about the translation of these two works together because the style of the writing is quite different. Yermiyahu, you pointed out the kind of sparseness and directness of the writing. It strikes me there's also a great volume to how much Briggs had to write about his life experience, his ghetto experience, his experience of the war. Sutzkever's works are poetic, lyrical. I think we would not use the words direct or sparse to describe them. And Zachary, you mentioned though that they're cyclical, right? That he returns to similar topics or moments and describes them in different ways, in different kinds of writing that he does. So I guess I would just ask either of you to share something about the process of translating these works and maybe with the more specific question of, does it change your work as a translator to be working on material representing Holocaust experiences? Is there some kind of weight, I guess is the first word that comes to my mind, about approaching this work that feels different from your other work as translators or writers? But anything that you would like to share about the process, kind of given the great differences in style of these two works together. Zachary, would you like to speak first?
Yeah, I think obviously there are other parts of Sutzkever's work which are directly related to the Holocaust in a more nonfiction way. From some of his long epic narrative works to his works on the ghetto, which currently have or are currently being translated. I have to say that in these prose poetry works, I didn't feel a Holocaust-specific weight, and I think that's because of the ahistoricity of the text and the fact that the real attention and the real difficulty was in getting the lyricism and the word choice right, and in just there was so many thickets of like images and making sure it was all clear. And so that really occupied the bulk of my attention. There were times when I wanted to make sure the imagery was not overwhelming. There's more than one, not overpowering, I guess, exact in a way that Sutzkever can be very Baroque in his prose poetry, but be exact. And so there's more than one occasion in this work where he talks about escaping people bent on his death, and there's searchlights and and he's running over ice, or someone else is running over ice and snow. And getting that right, whatever that means, aesthetically, in prosody and in prose and idiom, is a special responsibility. But I think I realized that maybe in hindsight, and again in the moment, I was really concerned technically with how not to fall on my face as a translator and exactly render it. So I guess that's my provisory answer.
So, well, first of all, a couple things. Brix really wrote in different tones, and he wrote in different genres. So he wrote a book of poetry, which is very lovely, very lyric, and there's a mastery of the exquisite in Jungri Mai. There's a kind of luxuriating in the world, in the beauty of the world, that's very powerful. He also wrote poetry about the Holocaust. So he did write in different tones. These particular works are more Spartan and direct. So yeah, I just wanted to get that out, that there's a range, and there's documents in the Yiddish archives which look to me like manuscripts that have not been published. So there's a lot yet to be discovered about Rachmiel Brix. In terms of the challenges, there were many. There's a lot of Polish in the book. So the question is, how to render it. And in most cases, Brix himself provides like a Yiddish gloss, internal gloss next to it. So I kind of followed his model, just as to show the kind of multilingual world that Brix lived in. There are all these differences, different approaches to translation, where, there's one school that says the goal is to present, a seamless read so that you wouldn't even have known it was translated. And then there's another approach that says, show me, let's see the messiness, let's see the challenges. You don't have to hide them. You don't have to present a gleaming, polished, seamless whole. And then there's things in between, and there are moments when translators, often it's a combination of those two polarities. There's also just the vocabularies to master, the language of war. So, there's incendiary bombs versus destructive bombs. There's airplane terminology. There's vocabulary of, the Holocaust, concentration camps, blocks and commandants, and there's each of, and then the first book had all this language of clothing, so each of the books had their own challenges, and we're so far away, and sometimes there's things you could try to find, but you just hope you did it right. In terms of the Holocaust per se, I was very aware of the drive to memorialize that sort of is the thrust, the imperative of the Brix project as a whole. And one of the ways I tried to do that, like he knew a lot of people, and he ran into a lot of people, like as they were fleeing or in the camps, or like he just, yeah. So in some cases, to the extent I could, I did some research and tried to incorporate that in a dramatis personae, a list of people, who they were. I provided their dates. So there was actually a lot of, additional research that I had to do for this book, just to, situate the reader, because, who's going to know who all these people were? I mean, Gebertig, most people know, but, maybe not everyone. So in doing that, I was aware of that too as a form of memorialization, and that was definitely a part of it. And then even just the research, you know, when I was talking about Simcha Lazar, Brix's brother, you know, just, I mean, I think this is something that all people who work in Holocaust studies, you know, come to terms with. And, you know, each human life is sacred, and whatever we can do to memorialize and to honor is a holy mission. So I definitely felt that, like, in all the different phases of the project, you know, whether I was on the streets of Poland or in the Evo archives or just alone in front of my computer screen, you know, I tried to keep that imperative foregrounded.
Yeah, I appreciate very much how much you've shared about the different kinds of research that are involved in this project, and the kinds of research that may feel necessary to the work of translation, which is not necessarily apparent to anyone thinking about what it takes to bring a book from one language into another. But the being in the spaces is something that strikes me as very important, and appreciate that you shared that about, you know, what it means to go to the different places that these works are about, and how that will somehow inform, you know, what the English language work is that you eventually create. So we have a question for Zachary about the genre of the pieces by Sutzkever. So I think you mentioned, you know, that he had different terminology for how he described them, whether they are prose poems or short stories. So the question is, you know, specifically the piece you read, how you consider the genre of that, if it's a prose poem or a short story, but maybe you could say more about how you've come to understand, you know, what genre they're in, why it matters, maybe if it does matter. And obviously these pieces are written over a long period of time, right? So probably one description doesn't fit all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a very good question. I think genres matter for many reasons, as to find similarities and differences, to help trace lines of influence, to know how to best to compare things. And obviously any genre is porous, and there are poems that are more prose than poetry, and short stories that are more, you know, narrative than poetic. I think, you know, I think obviously, unsurprisingly, I'm going to say that the individual works, shorter works in the larger book, run the gamut, right? There are those of them that are more poetic and less narrative. There's less the beginning, middle, end. There's less resolution. There's less character development. There's less plot. There's some of them have very little plot, to the extent that one discusses the different spectrums of the color green and beings floating in an aquarium. That doesn't necessarily further plot, right? And there are some, like the piece I read just now was pretty narrative, right? It had a beginning, it had character development, it had an arc, it had a plot line. So I think it's proper to call them short stories if you like. And I think that, so I'll defend the term short stories and I'll defend the term prose poetry. Short stories, because Sutzkever wrote a lot of things. He didn't write, and someone's going to trip me up when I say this. He didn't write novels. He wrote novelistic poems, he wrote epic poems, but he wrote short stories, and this is like a lot of writers write short stories, and this is what Sutzkever short stories are, right? This is what they were, right? So that's one defense of why to call them short stories. And why do we call them prose poems? Because he was a poet, right? This is his primary literary identity and way of being on the earth, right? And so he saw himself as completing, fomenting, furthering a singular poetic prophetic mission. And this is one way of doing it for him. So in that way, they're definitely prose poems, right? They're definitely poetic works. You can recognize the motifs from the other poems. You recognize words, right? You got your rows, right? You got your fiddles. You got your minefields, right? You got all the Sutzkeverism in these works. So in that regard, you could definitely say it's prose poetry. So I'm going to come down confidently on both sides.
Wonderful, very definitive. I'm sure that satisfies absolutely everyone.
Everybody, yes.
Thank you, Zachary. A question for you, Yermiyahu, from the audience is if you could tell us a bit about how you first learned about BRICS and these books specifically.
So I heard about this Rachmiel bricks through an ad that I saw in the Yiddish Forward back when the Yiddish Forward came out in paper. And I was just, flipping through it, and I saw an ad that Rachmiel Bricks' daughter, Bella Bricks Klein, was giving a talk at the Shalom Aleichem Cultural Center in the Bronx, New York. And one thing led to another, and I was like, who's Bricks? And I mentioned his name to my friend Cecile Kuznets, who teaches at Bard, and Cecile knows Bella, and she kind of put us into contact, and yeah, the rest is history.
Thank you. Okay, thank you both so much for joining us, for sharing your work with us, for doing the years of work to bring these books into publication in English. Thanks to everybody who attended our event today. Paz has shared information in the chat about how you can purchase these works if you're interested in finding them and reading them for yourselves, and a link to the Yiddish Book Center's website if you'd like to learn more about us and the work that we do. And I will just say a thanks again to the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass for co-sponsoring this event with the Yiddish Book Center. Really pleased to get to share this work in this forum. And our thanks to the staff who helped organize it. So be well. Thanks everyone for coming. Seid gesund. Grüßen Dank.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.